Now that your husband is gone, if you can't help with the bills, you'll end up out on the street, my daughter-in-law said during dinner. My son lowered his eyes and kept eating like he hadn't heard a thing. I folded my napkin carefully, stood up without a word, and walked upstairs to the bedroom I had shared with my husband for 41 years. That night, I didn't cry. The next morning, I went to the bank. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from so I could see how far my story has reached. The dining room had felt colder ever since Harold died. Not physically cold. The heat was running, and the old chandelier above the table still cast the same soft yellow light it always had. But the warmth was gone, the kind of warmth a person brings into a room simply by existing. It had been 9 days since we buried my husband. 9 days since I stood beside a polished oak casket while neighbors brought casseroles and whispered condolences I barely remembered hearing. 9 days since I held Harold's hand in a hospital room and listened to the steady machine beside him go silent. At 70 years old, I thought grief would arrive gently, quietly, like winter snow settling over the earth. I was wrong. Grief arrived like an empty chair at the dinner table, like half a closet untouched, like reaching for someone in the middle of the night and finding cold sheets instead. I looked down at my plate, though I had barely eaten more than 2 bites of the pot roast sitting in front of me. Across from me, Melissa scrolled through her phone with one manicured finger while my son Brian stared at the television mounted above the kitchen counter. Neither of them had spoken much all evening. Finally, Melissa sighed dramatically and placed her wine glass down. "We need to be realistic," she said. I glanced up slowly. About what? The house. The bills. Everything. Her voice was sharp, impatient. Harold handled most of the finances, didn't he? Before I could answer, Brian cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mom, utilities have gone up a lot. Property taxes, too." I stared at him. This was the same boy who used to run into my arms after Little League games. The same boy who once cried because he thought leaving for college meant he'd never see me again. Now he couldn't even look me in the eye. "I've lived in this house for 36 years, I said quietly. "Your father and I managed just fine." Melissa laughed under her breath. "Well, Harold's not here anymore." The words landed harder than she probably intended, or maybe exactly as hard as she intended. I felt something tighten painfully in my chest. Outside, rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. Somewhere upstairs, the grandfather clock Harold inherited from his father chimed 8 times. Melissa leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "I'm just saying," she continued, "if you expect to stay here, you need to contribute. Otherwise," she shrugged casually, "maybe it's time to think about somewhere smaller, somewhere more appropriate." Appropriate, as if I were suddenly some burden taking up too much space. I looked at Brian one last time, waiting for him to defend me, to say something, anything, but he stayed silent. And in that silence, I realized something far more painful than losing my husband. I was losing my family too. That night, I sat alone in the bedroom Harold and I had shared for more than 4 decades. The house sounded different without him. Every little noise seemed louder now. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway, rainwater sliding through the gutters outside the bedroom window. Harold used to fill the silence without even trying. Sometimes he would hum old Frank Sinatra songs while folding laundry. Sometimes he'd fall asleep in his recliner with the television still playing baseball highlights at low volume. Small things, ordinary things, but when they disappear, you realize they were holding your entire world together. I looked around the bedroom slowly. His reading glasses still rested on a nightstand beside his half-finished mystery novel. His navy robe still hung behind the bathroom door, exactly where he left it the morning before his heart attack. I still couldn't bring myself to move any of it. Downstairs, I heard cabinet doors opening and closing. Melissa. She had started reorganizing the kitchen 2 days after the funeral. According to her, it was more efficient. The coffee mugs Harold and I used every morning disappeared from the lower cabinet because she said they looked outdated. My spice rack was moved. Family photos were taken off the refrigerator and replaced with some expensive calendar full of minimalist artwork. Tiny changes, but each one felt like someone erasing pieces of my life 1 inch at a time. The next morning, I woke up early out of habit. Harold always liked breakfast at 6:30 sharp, even after retirement. For 41 years, I made coffee while he read the newspaper at the kitchen table. Now the chair across from me sat empty. I poured 2 cups before realizing what I'd done. My hands trembled slightly as I poured the second cup back into the pot. Outside, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds. November in Ohio always looked tired somehow. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself and sat quietly at the table. A few minutes later, Brian walked into the kitchen wearing wrinkled work clothes and holding his phone. "Morning, Mom," he muttered distractedly. "Morning." For a second, I thought maybe things would feel normal again. Maybe last night had only been stress and grief talking. Then he opened the refrigerator and frowned. "You really need to stop keeping so much expired stuff in here," he said casually. I stared at him. Those were Harold's favorite preserves. Homemade peach jam I came myself back in August. Before I could answer, Melissa entered the kitchen in silk pajamas, already irritated. "Brian, don't forget we have that meeting at 2, she reminded him before glancing at me. "And Linda from the senior living community is supposed to call later." The words hit me, so suddenly I almost dropped my coffee cup. Senior living community. Not even 10 days after burying my husband. Brian froze for half a second, like he regretted hearing it out loud. But Melissa just opened the fridge and continued talking. "They have openings now, but apparently units go fast." I looked at my son, slowly, carefully. "Are you trying to send me away?" Neither of them answered immediately. And somehow, that silence hurt worse than if they had simply said yes. The rest of that morning passed in strained silence. Brian left for work without finishing his coffee. Melissa stayed in the kitchen scrolling through furniture listings on her tablet, while I quietly washed dishes at the sink. Neither of them mentioned the senior living community again, but they didn't need to. Once certain words are spoken out loud, they linger in the air like smoke. Around noon, I went upstairs to lie down for a while. My chest felt heavy, not from illness, but from the strange realization that I no longer recognized the home I had lived in for most of my adult life. As I passed Harold's office, I stopped. The door was closed. That alone felt wrong. Harold never closed that door unless he was balancing taxes or working on paperwork. Even after he retired, the room remained open, warm, lived in. I reached for the handle instinctively. Locked. I stood there staring at the brass knob for several seconds. Then I heard footsteps downstairs. Melissa's voice drifted upward first. "We have to handle it before she changes her mind." Brian answered quietly, too low for me to hear clearly. "I know," Melissa snapped, "but dragging this out is only going to make things harder." My stomach tightened. I stepped away from the office door before they noticed me standing there. That afternoon, while Melissa left for a nail appointment and Brian was still at work, I walked slowly through the house, noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. Harold's framed Navy photo had disappeared from the hallway shelf. The file cabinet in the den had been moved slightly. And in the laundry room trash can, I spotted shredded papers mixed with dryer sheets and grocery receipts. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. Carefully, I pulled out a few strips and pieced them together on top of the washing machine. Most of it was unreadable, except for one line. Assisted living application. My hands went cold. For a moment, I simply stood there listening to the washing machine hum softly beside me. I remembered changing Brian's diapers in this very room, folding his Little League uniforms, ironing Harold's, church shirts every Sunday night. 40 years of memories reduced to paperwork someone was trying to hide from me. I sank slowly onto the edge of the old wooden chair near the dryer. Maybe Melissa was behind all of this. That would have been easier to believe. But Brian knew. That was the part breaking my heart. Not the house. Not the bills. Not even the humiliation. My son knew they were planning to send me away, and he was allowing it to happen. Late that evening, Brian finally came home looking exhausted. I was sitting alone in the living room with Harold's old photo album open across my lap. He loosened his tie and stopped when he saw me awake. "Mom, we need to talk tomorrow," he said carefully. I looked up at him. For the first time since Harold died, I noticed something unfamiliar in my son's face. Not guilt, avoidance. And suddenly, I realized there was far more happening behind my back than I had imagined. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For years, Harold and I had started our mornings the same way. Coffee brewing at 6. Local news playing softly in the background. Him sitting at the kitchen table, reading the paper while I watered the plants near the window. Routine becomes invisible when you live inside it long enough. You only notice it after it disappears. I moved slowly through the kitchen, careful not to make noise. Brian and Melissa were still asleep upstairs in the guest room they had taken over after moving in temporarily 6 months earlier. Temporary. That word almost made me laugh now. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and stared out the window at Harold's garden in the backyard. The rose bushes looked neglected already. Harold used to trim them every Saturday morning without fail. He loved taking care of things, especially people. A memory surfaced suddenly. 3 years earlier, after one of Melissa's arguments with Brian, she stormed out of the house during Thanksgiving dinner. Harold had quietly put on his coat, driven across town in freezing rain, and brought her back himself. "She's family," he told me afterward while drying his glasses with a dish towel. "Family needs patience." I believed him. Maybe that was my mistake. Around 8 o'clock, I heard footsteps upstairs followed by hushed voices. Then silence. Then my name. "She's going to ask questions," Melissa whispered sharply. "We'll handle it," Brian replied. I sat perfectly still at the kitchen table. A few minutes later, they entered together. Melissa smiled too quickly. Brian looked exhausted again. "Morning, Mom," he said. I nodded calmly. Melissa opened the refrigerator and immediately frowned. "We really need to clean this thing out," she muttered. "There's old food everywhere." I looked at her without speaking. This woman had entered my home 10 years ago carrying a peach pie and calling me Mom. I helped pay for their wedding. I babysat when they couldn't afford daycare. I even covered Brian's mortgage payments one winter after he lost his job. And now she looked at me like I was something outdated cluttering up her future. Brian sat across from me, rubbing his temples. "Mom, maybe we should talk about long-term plans." There was again. Careful wording. Soft tone. Like I might not notice what they were really saying. "What kind of plans?" I asked quietly. Brian hesitated. Melissa answered for him. "This house is a lot for someone your age to manage alone." Alone. The word echoed in my chest. Not because Harold was gone, but because they had already decided I didn't belong here anymore. I set my coffee cup down carefully. "You mean after I leave?" I said. Brian immediately looked uncomfortable. Melissa crossed her arms. "We're just trying to be practical." Practical. Funny how cruel people become when they hide behind practical words. I studied my son's face for a long moment. Then I noticed something strange. He kept glancing toward Harold's office down the hallway, almost nervously. And in that moment, I realized they weren't just trying to remove me from the house. They were looking for something. That afternoon, after Brian left for work, I stood outside Harold's office again. The door was still locked. Sunlight from a hallway window stretched across the carpet in long pale lines while I stared at the brass handle, remembering how many evenings Harold had spent inside that room balancing checkbooks or organizing paperwork. He was meticulous about finances. Every receipt labeled, every insurance document filed, every tax return stacked neatly in dated folders. "Preparation is peace of mind," he always used to say. At the time, I thought it was just one of his old-fashioned habits. Now I wondered if he had been preparing for something else entirely. I glanced downstairs to make sure Melissa was still outside on the patio, talking loudly on her phone. Then I walked quietly into our bedroom and opened Harold's nightstand drawer. Inside, beneath an old flashlight and reading glasses, sat a small silver key taped underneath the drawer, exactly where Harold used to hide spare cash during vacations. My heart started beating faster. I returned to the office slowly and slid the key into the lock. Click. The door opened immediately. The room smelled faintly like leather and cedarwood. Harold's dark green desk lamp still sat in the corner beside his favorite fountain pen. Everything looked untouched, almost sacred. For a moment, grief hit me, so suddenly I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself. I could almost hear his voice. Almost see him sitting there in his reading chair asking me if I wanted more coffee. Then I noticed the drawers. Open. Not wide open. Just enough to tell someone else had already searched through them. A cold feeling crept through my stomach. I stepped carefully toward the filing cabinet beside the bookshelf. Several folders were crooked, shuffled out of order. Harold would never have left them like that. Someone had been in here recently. Someone looking for something important. I opened the top drawer slowly. Insurance papers. Property taxes. Bank statements. Then my eyes landed on a thick manila folder labeled simply, Family Trust. I froze. Before I could reach for it, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Quick footsteps. Melissa appeared in the doorway, so suddenly it made me jump. For half a second, her expression changed completely. Not surprise. Panic. Then the fake smile returned. "Oh," she said lightly, folding her arms. "I didn't realize you were in here." I kept one hand resting calmly on the filing cabinet. "This is my husband's office." Her eyes flickered briefly toward the folder before returning to me. Brian had done the same thing earlier. That was when I knew for certain. Whatever they were planning, it had something to do with Harold's paperwork. Melissa stepped into the room carefully. "You really shouldn't stress yourself with financial documents right now," she said softly. "It's probably overwhelming." Overwhelming. Interesting choice of words from someone who suddenly seemed terrified that I might start reading. I looked directly at her for the first time in days. And instead of grief, I felt something new settling quietly inside me. Suspicion. Melissa stayed in the doorway watching me too carefully. I closed the filing cabinet drawer slowly and gave her a small smile. "You're right," I said softly. "I'm probably too emotional to deal with paperwork right now." The tension in her shoulders eased almost immediately. People become careless when they think you're weak. "Oh, good," she replied quickly. "That's probably for the best." I nodded once and walked past her into the hallway, carrying nothing in my hands. But as I passed the desk, I had already noticed something important. The folder labeled Family Trust had a blue tab sticking out from the side. Harold only used blue tabs for finalized legal documents, meaning whatever was inside had already been signed and completed. That night, I barely slept. Rain tapped softly against the bedroom windows while memories circled endlessly through my mind. Harold sitting beside me at church. Harold teaching Brian how to drive in the high school parking lot. Harold squeezing my hand during chemo treatments 15 years earlier and promising me we would grow old together. And somewhere between those memories came another thought. Harold knew Brian better than I wanted to admit. Maybe better than I did. Around midnight, I heard footsteps downstairs. Quiet footsteps. I slipped out of bed carefully and opened the bedroom door just enough to see into the hallway below. A light glowed under Harold's office door. Someone was inside. I moved silently down the staircase, my hand gripping the railing tightly. Halfway down, I heard drawers opening, papers shuffling, then Melissa's whisper. "There has to be another copy somewhere." Brian sounded nervous. "Maybe Dad already transferred everything before." "Keep looking," she snapped. I stopped breathing for a second. Transferred everything? My chest tightened painfully, but I stayed completely still in the shadows near the staircase. More papers shuffled. Then Brian spoke again, quieter this time. "If Mom finds out before we do, this could become a disaster." "Mom." Not she. Not your mother. "Mom." The word almost made this worse somehow. I slowly stepped backward before they could notice me standing there. Back upstairs, I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a long time. The grief was still there. Heavy. Constant. But now something else sat beside it. Awareness. Harold hadn't just left paperwork behind. He had left something they desperately wanted. The next morning, I acted exactly the same as before. Quiet. Distracted. Grieving. I folded laundry while Melissa talked endlessly about home renovations she wanted to make someday. I listened while Brian discussed refinancing options at the kitchen table. Neither of them realized I was paying attention now. Really paying attention. Then, just after lunch, the phone rang. Melissa answered first. Her expression changed immediately. "Oh," she said carefully. "She's here." A pause. "Yes. I suppose that's fine." She slowly lowered the phone and looked toward me. "There's someone here asking for you," she said. "Who?" Melissa hesitated. "A lawyer." For a moment, nobody moved. Brian looked up from the kitchen table so fast he nearly knocked over his coffee cup. Melissa's face lost color almost instantly, though she tried to hide it behind a tight smile. "A lawyer," I repeated calmly. Melissa nodded too quickly. She said her name is Patricia Keller. The name hit me with a strange sense of familiarity. Then I remembered. Patricia Keller had been Harold's attorney for nearly 20 years. Suddenly, the silence in the kitchen felt very different. Brian stood up immediately. "Mom, maybe we should reschedule, or no," I interrupted softly. "I'll speak with her." I walked toward the front door slowly, aware of both of them watching me from behind. Patricia stood on the porch wearing a long gray coat and holding a leather folder against her chest. She looked to be in her 60s, sharp-eyed but kind. The moment she saw me, her expression softened. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said gently, "I'm very sorry about Harold." "Thank you." Behind me, I could feel Melissa practically holding her breath. Patricia glanced briefly over my shoulder toward the kitchen before lowering her voice slightly. "May I speak with you privately?" I nodded immediately. Melissa stepped forward at once. "Actually, anything you need to discuss can probably be handled here." Patricia looked directly at her. "I'm afraid this matter concerns Mrs. Whitmore specifically. Not Brian. Not Melissa. Me." For the first time in days, I saw uncertainty flicker across Melissa's face. I led Patricia into the living room and quietly closed the doors behind us. The house suddenly felt very still. Patricia sat across from me and placed the leather folder carefully on the coffee table between us. "Harold contacted me 3 months ago," she began. "After his second hospital stay, a cold feeling settled into my chest. Harold had known his condition was worse than he admitted. He asked me to prepare several legal protections," Patricia continued carefully, "specifically concerning the house, financial accounts, and your long-term security." My fingers tightened around the edge of the sofa cushion. Outside, wind rattled the bare tree branches against the windows. "He was worried," she said quietly. "About what?" Patricia hesitated only briefly. "That you might be pressured after his death." The room went completely silent. Not because I was shocked, but because deep down, part of me already knew. Harold had seen something coming long before I did. Patricia slowly opened the folder. Inside were documents with blue tabs, exactly like the one I had seen in Harold's office. My pulse quickened. Then Patricia slid one paper gently toward me. "The house," she said calmly, "was transferred fully into your name 6 weeks before Harold passed away." Histoire de hair. For a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood. "But," Brian said, my voice trailed off. Patricia's expression remained steady. Brian was never informed of the final revisions. From the kitchen, I heard a sudden sharp noise, like someone dropping a glass. And at that exact moment, I realized something important. Brian and Melissa weren't trying to protect me. They were trying to beat me to something they thought still belonged to them. I sat there staring at the document while my hands trembled slightly against the paper. The house belonged to me. Not partly, not temporarily, fully. Harold had transferred everything quietly before he died. Every mortgage payment we had made. Every Christmas hosted in that dining room. Every summer evening spent on the back porch together. It had all been protected long before Melissa started planning my future for me. Patricia adjusted her glasses gently. "There's more," she said. I looked up slowly. Harold created a trust that releases additional assets to Brian under specific conditions. A strange feeling settled into my chest. "What kind of conditions?" Patricia hesitated carefully, choosing her words. "The trust becomes void if there's evidence of coercion, intimidation, or attempts to remove you from the property against your wishes." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Harold knew. Somehow, my husband had seen all of this coming before I ever did. I remember the last few months before his death. The long, quiet moments when he would sit in his recliner watching Brian and Melissa argue softly in the kitchen. The way he started asking strange questions late at night. If something ever happened to me, he once said quietly, "Would you promise not to let anyone push you around?" At the time, I laughed it off. Now I understood why he asked. A knock interrupted the silence. Before either of us answered, The living room door slowly opened. Brian stepped inside, looking pale. "Mom," he started carefully. "What's going on?" Patricia closed the folder calmly. "Your father updated several legal arrangements before his passing." Brian's eyes immediately shifted toward the documents on the table. Not toward me. The documents. That told me everything. Melissa appeared behind him moments later, arms crossed tightly. "What kind of arrangements?" she asked. Patricia remained professional, but her voice became colder. "Arrangements designed to protect Mrs. Whitmore." Nobody spoke. The tension in the room felt heavy enough to touch. Brian rubbed the back of his neck nervously. Dad never mentioned changing anything. "No, Patricia replied evenly." He wouldn't have. Melissa forced out a laugh that sounded completely unnatural. "Well, obviously nobody's trying to hurt Eleanor." "Eleanor? Not Mom anymore. Not even pretend kindness now." Patricia looked directly at her. "Then I'm sure these protections won't be a problem." Melissa's expression hardened instantly. Just for a second. But I saw it. So did Patricia. Brian looked trapped between panic and embarrassment. His face reminded me of the little boy who used to hide broken report cards behind his back, hoping I wouldn't notice. Except now he was a grown man, standing in my living room, hoping I wouldn't realize he had already betrayed me. I slowly closed the folder in front of me. And for the first time since Harold died, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt steady, because suddenly I understood why Harold spent his final months organizing paperwork so carefully. He wasn't preparing for death. He was preparing me for what came after it. After Patricia left, the house felt unusually quiet. Not peaceful, careful, like everyone inside was suddenly measuring every word before speaking. Brian disappeared into the garage almost immediately after closing the front door behind Patricia. Melissa stayed in the kitchen pretending to wipe already clean countertops while stealing nervous glances toward the living room. I sat calmly in Harold's recliner with the folder resting unopened on my lap. For the first time in weeks, I stopped feeling like a guest in my own home. That seemed to bother Melissa more than anything. Around dinner time, she finally broke the silence. "So," she said casually while setting plates on the table, "what exactly did the lawyer want?" I looked up slowly. She was reviewing Harold's final arrangements. Melissa forced a small smile. "Right? Of course. Nothing else. No fake sympathy. No questions about how I felt. Just quiet frustration that she still didn't know everything inside that folder." Brian barely touched his food that night. He kept checking his phone while avoiding eye contact with me entirely. I watched both of them quietly, and suddenly little things from the past started fitting together differently. Melissa insisting they move in temporarily. Brian asking strange questions about refinancing months before Harold died. The sudden interest in bills, property taxes, and insurance paperwork right after the funeral. This hadn't started after Harold passed away. It started long before. Later that evening, I carried the folder upstairs to my bedroom and locked the door behind me. Then, slowly, I read everything. The trust documents, the property transfer, the handwritten letter folded carefully near the back. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means I'm no longer there to protect you in person." By the second sentence, my vision blurred. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, while Harold's familiar handwriting shook gently in my hands. He apologized for leaving me alone. He reminded me that kindness and weakness were not the same thing. And then one sentence stopped me completely. "I have watched people underestimate you for years. Please don't start doing it yourself." I pressed the letter against my chest and closed my eyes. Harold knew me better than anyone. Even now, especially now, downstairs, I heard Brian and Melissa arguing quietly again. Their voices drifted upward through the vents. "She knows something," Melissa hissed. "Well, maybe if you hadn't pushed so hard." "I pushed hard," she snapped. "Your father changed everything behind our backs." "Our backs. Not mine. Theirs." I remained perfectly still in the bedroom, listening to every word. Then Brian said something that hurt more than I expected. "We just needed security, Melissa." Security. That was how they justified it to themselves. Not greed. Not betrayal. Security. I looked around the bedroom Harold and I built together over 4 decades. The framed family photos. The quilt my mother stitched before she passed away. The soft yellow lamp Harold refused to replace because he liked the warm light it gave off at night. This house held my entire life. And downstairs, my own son had quietly started treating it like an opportunity. That was the moment something inside me finally changed. I stopped feeling afraid of losing my home and started wondering how long I was willing to let them stay in it. The next few days felt strangely polite. Too polite. Melissa suddenly started asking if I needed tea. Brian offered to carry groceries inside without being asked. They smiled more, spoke softer, but kindness that arrives after fear never feels real. I noticed something else too. They stopped mentioning senior living communities altogether. No more brochures left on the counter. No more conversations that suddenly ended when I entered the room. Patricia's visit had changed the balance inside the house, and they knew it. On Thursday evening, Brian came home earlier than usual carrying takeout bags from my favorite Italian restaurant downtown. That alone told me something was wrong. Melissa never liked the smell of garlic in the house. "We thought maybe you'd enjoy a nice dinner," Brian said awkwardly. I looked at the paper bag quietly. Lasagna, breadsticks, lemon cake, all my favorites. The kind of meal you bring someone when you want something from them. Dinner felt almost normal at first. Melissa laughed too loudly at Brian's jokes. Brian kept refilling my water glass before it was empty. Anyone looking in through the dining room windows might have thought we were a happy family, finally healing after loss. But grief sharpens your instincts, and mine were screaming. Halfway through dinner, Melissa casually set down her wine glass. "You know," she began carefully, "this house is probably worth a fortune now." There it was. Brian immediately stared at his plate. I folded my napkin slowly onto my lap. "It's not really about money," Melissa continued quickly. "It's just this place is huge for one person." One person. Interesting how she still spoke as though I were already alone here. Brian finally cleared his throat. "Mom, maybe we should discuss long-term plans together." Rationally. Rationally. Another careful word. I took a small sip of water before answering. "What kind of plans?" Melissa leaned forward slightly. "Well, maybe selling the house could help everyone financially. You could get a beautiful condo somewhere easier to maintain. Help everyone, not help me." I noticed Brian still couldn't look directly at me. Instead, his eyes kept drifting toward the hallway leading to Harold's office. Still worried about paperwork. Still worried about money. I set my glass down carefully. "You seem very concerned about this house," I said quietly. Melissa smiled too fast again. "We're just thinking about the future." I nodded slowly. "So am I." Something in my voice must have unsettled them both because the room suddenly became silent. Outside, cold November wind rattled against the windows while the grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. For 41 years, Harold and I built a life inside those walls. And now, two people sitting across from me were trying to calculate its value like it was just another investment. Melissa finally forced a small laugh. "Well, no pressure, of course." "Of course." I looked calmly at both of them. Then I smiled for the first time since Harold died. Not because I was happy, because I finally understood something important. They still believed I was grieving too deeply to notice what they were doing. And that misunderstanding was becoming their biggest mistake. 2 days later, Patricia returned to the house. This time, she came with additional paperwork. Brian nearly stopped breathing when he saw her car pull into the driveway. Melissa's entire face tightened the moment the front door opened. I invited Patricia into the dining room, while Brian hovered nearby, pretending to check emails on his phone. No one fooled anyone anymore. Patricia placed a thin stack of documents neatly on the table. "I just need a few signatures confirming the property transfer and trust activation," she explained calmly. Melissa immediately sat down beside Brian. "Shouldn't we all review everything together?" she asked. Patricia looked at her politely. "These documents concern Mrs. Whitmore directly." Again, not them. Me. I noticed Melissa's jaw tightened slightly. Brian finally spoke up. "Mom, maybe we should slow down and talk through all this first." I turned toward him carefully. "Talk through what exactly?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For a moment, he looked genuinely ashamed. But Melissa stepped in quickly. "We're family," she said smoothly. "Big financial decisions affect everyone." There was again. Everyone. Funny how easily people include themselves when money is involved. Patricia adjusted her glasses calmly. "Legally speaking, the property belongs solely to Mrs. Whitmore." The silence afterward felt enormous. Melissa leaned back in her chair, arms crossed tightly now. "Well," she muttered, I guess Harold made his priorities clear." The bitterness in her voice surprised even Brian. "Melissa," he warned quietly, but she was already losing control. "For months we've been trying to help," she snapped. "Do you know how stressful this has been for us?" "Us. Always us." I looked at her quietly across the dining room table, where I had hosted birthdays, Christmas dinners, and Thanksgiving meals for years. This woman once cried in my arms after her own mother passed away. Now she looked at me like I was standing between her and a paycheck. Brian rubbed his forehead hard. "Can we please not do this right now?" Melissa laughed sharply. "No, Brian. Let's do it now." Her eyes turned toward me. "You've been treating us like criminals ever since that lawyer showed up." I held her stare calmly. "You were searching Harold's office before his funeral flowers were gone." The room went completely still. Brian's face drained of color. Melissa blinked once, caught off guard. Then came the anger. "We were trying to protect this family," she snapped loudly. "No," I said quietly. "You were trying to protect access to my house." Brian stood abruptly from the table. "Mom, that's not fair." I looked at my son for a long moment. Not angrily, just sadly. "When your father died," I said softly, "I lost the person who loved me most in this world." Brian's eyes lowered immediately. "And less than 2 weeks later," I continued, "you were discussing assisted living behind my back." Nobody spoke. Outside, cold. Rain tapped against the dining room windows while the grandfather clock echoed softly through the hallway. For the first time since Harold passed away, the truth finally sat openly at the table with all of us. And no one could pretend anymore. Brian and Melissa moved out 3 weeks later. Not dramatically. No shouting. No slam doors. Just quiet tension filling the house, while cardboard boxes disappeared one by one through the front door. In the end, that somehow felt sadder. Brian avoided me most of those final days. He left early for work, came home late, and spent most evenings packing silently in the guest room. Melissa barely spoke at all. The night before they left, I found her standing alone in the kitchen, staring at the refrigerator. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she spoke quietly. "We really did need help financially." I nodded once. "I know," because I did know. The economy was hard. Mortgage rates were high. Life had become expensive for young families. But hardship changes people differently. Some become humble. Others become entitled. Melissa looked down at the floor. "I never thought Harold would cut us out." "He didn't," I replied softly. "He protected me. That was the difference." She didn't answer after that. The next morning, Brian carried the last box to the car while cold December winds swept leaves across the driveway. Before getting inside, he finally turned toward me. For a second, I saw the little boy I used to wait for outside elementary school, holding a backpack almost bigger than he was. "Mom," he started, then stopped. There are some apologies people want credit for more than they actually want forgiveness. I spared him from finishing. "Take care of yourself, Brian." His eyes filled slightly, but he nodded and climbed into the passenger seat beside his wife. I stood on the porch as their car disappeared slowly down the street. And just like that, the house became quiet again. Really quiet. At first, the silence hurt. Then gradually it began to heal me. I started sleeping through the night again. I replanted Harold's rose bushes before the first frost. I moved Melissa's minimalist calendar into storage and placed family photos back on the refrigerator where they belonged. Little things. But grief is survived through little things. One afternoon in early spring, I sat on the back porch wrapped in Harold's old flannel jacket while sunlight warmed the garden he loved so much. For the first time in months, I felt peaceful. Not because everything turned out perfectly. It didn't. I still miss my husband every single day. And losing trust in my own son left a wound deeper than I could explain. But Harold gave me one final gift before he left this world. Not money, not property, clarity. He understood something I was too loving to see for myself. Sometimes the people sitting closest to your table are already calculating what remains after you're gone. I looked out across the backyard as wind moved gently through the trees Harold planted years ago. Then I whispered the words I wished I had understood sooner. I lost my husband that winter, but I also lost the illusion that love alone keeps a family together.